In the final years of World War II, Japan was desperate to turn the tide of war. While Allied forces closed in from every direction, a secret team of engineers and pilots worked in the mountains of Hokkaido on a project that was meant to change history, a fighter jet unlike any the world had ever seen. Sleek, angular, and powered by an experimental turbojet engine, it was a machine decades ahead of its time. Its speed promised to break the skies, and its weapon systems could have rewritten the balance of power, but fate was cruel. As the war grew bloodier and the nation fractured under relentless bombardment, the jet was hidden away. Engineers, fearing capture, chose not to destroy their creation but to bury it deep beneath the earth, sealing it in a reinforced chamber. They believed that one day Japan might rise again, and the wing of tomorrow, as they called it, would return to the skies. Yet, history had other plans. The war ended in devastation, and with it, the secret was swallowed by time. For decades, no one remembered the buried weapon. Generations passed, cities were rebuilt, and the scars of war slowly healed. The story of the advanced fighter became nothing more than a whisper, an old rumor dismissed as fantasy. Then, nearly 80 years later, a group of archaeologists surveying a remote mountain site stumbled upon something extraordinary. Beneath layers of soil and stone, they uncovered a metallic structure unlike any known artifact. As excavation continued, the shape of a wing appeared, then a cockpit, and finally, the body of the forgotten fighter jet. When the news broke, the world was stunned. Engineers and historians crowded to examine the aircraft, their disbelief growing with every detail. The jet's design bore uncanny resemblance to the most modern stealth fighters, yet it had been built in the 1940s. The alloys, the aerodynamic curves, the advanced mechanics, all far beyond the known capabilities of the era. Japan was shaken to its core. People felt both pride and sorrow, pride that their ancestors had achieved such brilliance, and sorrow that it had come in the shadow of war and desperation. It was a reminder of what might have been if humanity's genius had been guided by peace instead of destruction. The fighter was eventually displayed in a museum, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. Scholars called it the ghost of tomorrow, a silent witness of how close Japan had been to changing the world and how far they had fallen from their true aim. The people realized that while their ancestors had been clear in vision, war had blurred the path, and so the jet remained, not in the skies as its creators intended, but in the hearts of those who saw it, a reminder that the greatest victories are not found in battle, but in what humanity chooses to build when peace is given a chance. If Japan had managed to finish, test, and field its advanced jet fighter in 1944-45, the skies of the Pacific would have looked very different. Allied pilots, who were used to dogfights with propeller-driven aircraft like the Zero or the Mustang, would suddenly find themselves facing an enemy that could fly almost twice their speed. The first missions would have been devastating. American bomber squadrons flying toward Japanese cities would be shredded in minutes, their escorts completely outclassed. A turning point in morale. The introduction of the jet would have given Japan a powerful psychological weapon. Soldiers and citizens alike, who were losing hope after years of bombing and defeat, would see the new aircraft as a miracle weapon. Propaganda would present it as proof that Japan still had the ability to win, and for a short time, the nation's morale would surge. On the Allied side, shock and fear would spread quickly. Military planners would worry that Japan might have even more advanced weapons hidden away. The strategic impact: if Japan had been able to produce enough of these jets, they might have delayed the destruction of their war industries. Factories and shipyards, constantly targeted by Allied bombers, could have been defended more effectively. This might have slowed down the Allies' island-hopping campaign and extended the war by several months, perhaps even into 1946. Naval battles could also have shifted. Imagine Japanese jets diving on American aircraft carriers, striking before slower planes could react. The harsh reality of resources. But here lies the key problem: Japan by 1944 was starving for resources. Oil was scarce, factories were in ruins, and supply lines had been cut off. Building one or two prototype jets was possible, but mass-producing hundreds was nearly impossible. Even if they had a fleet of jets, Japan did not have the fuel to keep them in the skies for long. The jet could win battles, but it could not win the entire war. Allied response: the Allies would not sit idle. They already knew Germany was testing the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, so the concept of jet warfare wasn't unknown. Once Japan's jet was revealed, the US and Britain would accelerate their own jet programs, and with their massive industrial capacity, they could have outproduced Japan within months. The skies would soon be filled with Allied jets, neutralizing Japan's advantage, the nuclear shadow. Even if Japan's jets had delayed the Allied bombing campaign, there was still the weapon Japan could not defend against, the atomic bomb. When the US dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no fighter jet, no matter how advanced, could have stopped the devastation. The war would have still ended in Japan's defeat, though perhaps after greater losses and more time. The legacy of the jet: if Japan had been able to use the jet, history would remember it as one of the most advanced machines of the era, proof that Japanese scientists and engineers were far ahead of their time. But instead of saving the nation, it would have stood as a symbol of tragedy, brilliance wasted in war, a glimpse of the future buried in the ashes of defeat. In short, if Japan had used the jet, they could have shocked the world, delayed defeat, and caused far heavier losses for the Allies. But limited resources and the arrival of the atomic bomb meant they still could not have achieved ultimate victory. One of the biggest reasons for Japan's failure was its lack of natural resources and industrial capacity. Japan was heavily dependent on imports of oil, steel, rubber, and other raw materials. Once the Allies cut off these supply lines through blockades and by capturing resource-rich territories, Japan's war machine began to starve. Factories could not keep up with production demands, and advanced weapons projects, like jets and ships, stalled because of shortages. In contrast, the United States had vast resources and an industrial base that could outproduce Japan many times over. Overextension of military forces: at the start of the war, Japan expanded aggressively, taking large parts of China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. This created an empire too large to defend. Japanese forces were spread thin across thousands of miles, fighting in China, Burma, the Philippines, New Guinea, and countless islands. Maintaining supply lines over such vast distances proved impossible, and Allied naval superiority slowly cut Japan off from its conquests. Naval and air inferiority over time. Initially, Japan had one of the strongest navies in the world and skilled pilots who shocked the Allies at Pearl Harbor and in early battles. But as the war dragged on, Japan failed to replace its losses. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be trained, while the US trained thousands of new pilots every year. Japan's Navy and Air Force began to lose battle after battle, especially after the defeats at Midway, 1942, and the Philippine Sea, 1944, where entire fleets and air groups were destroyed. Technological lag and missed opportunities. Japan did create some advanced weapons, like the Zero fighter and powerful battleships such as the Yamato. But as the war progressed, these became outdated. The US quickly developed better aircraft, radar systems, and eventually nuclear weapons. Japan's reliance on outdated strategies, like battleships and kamikaze attacks, could not compete with America's modern air power and aircraft carriers. Their secret projects, such as jet fighters and submarines, were either too late or too few to make a difference. Strategic miscalculations. Japan underestimated the resolve and industrial might of the United States. Leaders believed that a quick, shocking victory at Pearl Harbor would force America to negotiate peace. Instead, it fueled American determination for total victory. Japan also failed to coordinate effectively with Germany, leaving them isolated in the Pacific. Their decision to fight both China and the Western powers at the same time stretched their resources beyond repair. The atomic bomb and final collapse. By 1945, Japan was already collapsing due to massive bombings, starvation, and loss of territory. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the final blow. Even if Japan's leaders hoped to continue resisting, the overwhelming power of nuclear weapons, combined with the Soviet Union's entry into the war, forced them to surrender. Conclusion: Japan's failure was not because of lack of courage or innovation, but because of limited resources, overextension, poor strategic planning, and the overwhelming industrial and technological superiority of the Allies. In short, Japan could start the war with surprise victories, but it could not sustain a long global conflict against powers like the US and its allies.